Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with Ric Frank of the Jambalaya Brass Band. He talked at length about the newest 2018 CD called Habana to New Orleans. So the Jambalaya Brass Band is New York City's ultimate New Orleans party band. And since 1998, they've been doing that flavor straight from the New Orleans streets, paying their respects to that unique musical tradition that combines so many aspects of music we listen to today. Rick has performed with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, Treme Brass Band, Hot 8 Brass Band, and the Rebirth Brass Band, along with many others. He's a gifted musician and a great storyteller, so get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Well, hey, Rick, thanks for taking a minute out. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for calling. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, man. So let's start off here. I got the CD. I've had a chance to really listen to it. Habana to New Orleans, which I guess is kind of a moniker for you guys. You guys really traverse a lot of miles and a lot of time on the sound that you have. So talk to me about this album and how you feel about it.
I feel that it's my best work to date, for one. For two, it's a culmination of a number of years of traveling and research, and I've been to Cuba 4 times studying percussion, and mostly and some flute, and I've been going down to New Orleans since, I think, '04, doing research down there with brass bands, and all of this research and studying that I've had has been a wonderful perk for the school that I teach at, and they have this grant program which afforded me the possibility to do this. But it originally started out with there's an African proverb that says, you need to know where you're coming from in order to know where you're going to. And my feeling is that the vast majority of what we call American music is African-based. And initially, I was thinking of jazz and how that originated in New Orleans, but then I met somebody from the Georgia Sea Islands whose mother had worked with Bessie Jones and the Sea Island Singers, and David Pleasant, who's a phenomenal Renaissance man, musician, playwright, poet, choreographer. And I was at a workshop with him, and I was talking to him about this, and he said, it's not New Orleans. Everything really started in the Sea Islands, which is the first entry point of Africans into this country. And a lot of what you hear in the underlying beat of what we call, think of as New Orleans music, really originated as ring shout in the Sea Islands. And if you go even back into Africa, the rhythm is called bambula, which also appears in Haitian voodoo music, and you hear it as part of the Afro-Cuban clave. And so he told me about this course that was being taught at the Penn Center in St. Helena, South Carolina, which is, the Penn Center was the first school for free African Americans in this country, founded in 1865. And I went down there for a 2-week course studying the language, the culture, and the music. From that, then I started going down to New Orleans to research the brass band, which is really more unique to New Orleans. And met with people that had been the founding members of the Dirty Dozen Brass Band, and interviewed them, and also ended up meeting the father or the parents of Kirk Joseph, who was the sousaphonist, and Charles Joseph, they were their brothers who were founding members of the Dirty Dozen. And other members of the original Dirty Dozen I got a chance to interview and do some studying with, and I've since had a chance to sit in and play with these guys and a variety of other people. So I've been doing a lot of research with that. But then I happened upon Ned Sublet's book, Cuba and Its Music. And it talks about the long history of and connection between Cuba and New Orleans that goes back to slavery times and the cultural exchange that happened. And Jelly Roll Morton talks about the Latin tinge, and referring to the habanera rhythm, which really permeates a lot of New Orleans music, even to this day, and going back all the way to the early 1900s, possibly even earlier. So I decided, maybe I should try to get down to Cuba to study percussion. I played with a variety of Latin bands and recorded here in New York with Latin bands, but really the source of it is in Cuba. What happens in Puerto Rico and is very similar to Cuba, but Cuba predates all of that. And so I was afforded this opportunity through a grant to go down to Cuba and study and percussion. And the first two times I went down was percussion and flute. And the last two times it was strictly percussion. I studied privately with two different percussionists. The first one was Jose Ochoa, who's not well known, but the second person is a well-known percussionist and teacher down there, Jose Eladio Amat, who teaches at the National School of the Arts. Phenomenal musician, phenomenal person, like an encyclopedia of folkloric history there. And so I studied with him, and I also took this course that Conjunto Folclórico Nacional de Cuba runs called Folk Cuba. I did that for 2 years. And those two ways of studying were very different because the Folk Cuba course, which was 2 weeks long with Conjunto Folclórico, was strictly oral training. Musicians were not musically literate, but they were well-versed in the music. So I learned everything by ear there. But in my lessons with Jose Eladio, he would teach it to me first by ear, but then he would write everything out so that I would have a record of what it was, and I could go back and refer to it when I got back to the States, which has absolutely been very helpful in providing insight into the inner workings of the music. Of course, it's barely scratching the surface because it's so deep, all the various rhythms in Cuba, and depending on the region of where you are, how they differ. So taking that and digesting it and seeing how it connected with the music of New Orleans, particularly the brass band music, which I had, from early on, had noticed had clave in it, a lot of it. And so when I first started writing, even before I went to Cuba, I started writing music, and I created the band back in '98. Some of the pieces were very Latin tinged, but this album really was a culmination of all these studies and being able to incorporate the various rhythms. The first part of the CD is much more Cuban flavored, and there's rumba clave, and then there's son clave, which are similar, but they're very different also, and also in terms of stylistically, rumba is much more African, and son clave is much more, and religious too in some way, some of it. And son clave is much more secular, it's more dance music, although people do dance to rumba. And I went to this one club in Habana, very small club in central Habana, where I was one of 3 non-Cubans in the whole place. Very friendly, wonderful rumba group, and they had rumba dancers, and it was just, it was incredible. The first part of the album is connected with, rhythmically, with that. Some of it's rumba clave, some of it's son clave, and then the second half, from about, I think the 5th song, Dr. Buzzard, is much more New Orleans flavored. And the song Dr. Buzzard and the Bolito Man, those are two figures from the Sea Islands. And Dr. Buzzard was like a root man, a shaman who would cure people. And the Bolito Man was more like a numbers runner.
Yeah.
So I wanted to put a little bit of that in there in terms of the reference to where all of this started to happen here in America.
Let me ask you this. How did the band come together? How long have you guys been together as a group?
Sure. We've been together since '98, and at that time I was a division director and teaching at the Brooklyn Conservatory of Music. And we were coming up on the 100th anniversary of the school, and at one of the division director meetings we were talking about a celebration for the 100-year anniversary. And the executive director of the school was talking about, yeah, I'd like to have this parade coming down the street right in front of the school, and I'd like to, maybe have a Dixieland band. And the jazz division director didn't say anything. And I said, well, wait a minute, could we do something that's a little bit hipper than Dixieland? And actually, Dixieland's not the appropriate term because in New Orleans they don't call it that. It's got all these other racial overtones and whatnot. They call it traditional jazz. And I said, how about something like the Dirty Dozen? Something much more contemporary and hipper. And he was like, yeah, that sounds interesting. I said, can you provide some money to, write arrangements and to pay for the band to perform? Yeah, we can do that. I wrote a number of arrangements and put a band together, some of faculty and some of people that I knew from the music scene here. And we did it, and everybody had such a great time that they all wanted to continue doing it. And so I kept rehearsing the band and writing more songs and transcribing music from various brass bands. At one point I had gone to hear the Rebirth Brass Band and was talking with Phil Frazier, the band leader. I said, how would you feel, would it be okay if if we do covers of your tunes? Are you okay with that? And he said, absolutely. The Rebirth has since become, they're friends of mine at this point, and I've sat in with them on numerous occasions. And so we started doing Rebirth, and the Dirty Dozen became friends, and we started doing many of their tunes. And in the process, I started writing my own stuff as well for that, because I felt, in order to have our own voice and to be something more than just a cover band, we need original material as well. Through the conservatory, we had the opportunity to play some free concerts as part of the free Friday concert series at the conservatory. And we started getting other gigs around town and ended up going in and recording our first CD, which ended up being released on a internet label, but not promoted very well at all. Then a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, I guess, I'm losing track, we repackaged it and re-released it. It was originally called What You Looking At, which is one of the tracks on the CD, but we re-released it as On the Funky Side and did a whole repackaging of it. It's been promoted properly at this point, although it sort of looks like it's the second release, but it was really the first. And the band was much bigger. It was 9 pieces when we first started out. On occasion, we had, for one gig, which was a halftime show for the New York Knicks, we expanded it to 15 people, which was an incredible event to be playing in Madison Square Garden on the floor for halftime. But then 9/11 happened, and the bottom fell out of the economy, particularly here in New York. I'm sure this happened around the country too, but it was particularly hard hit here in New York, and so we went from 9 pieces down to 5. 1 trumpet, trombone, myself on saxophone, tuba, and just 1 drummer playing drum set. And eventually I ended up going with 2 drummers so that we could do parades. So we were 6 for quite a while, and then my trumpet player moved to Ecuador. And I had gotten spoiled by this guy. I had no idea or didn't realize how unique this guy was. Originally from Detroit, had played with many of the Motown groups and toured with them. And he is an anomaly in terms of trumpet players. He has endurance like nobody and can play high notes, long solos, and still have chops left over at the end of the night. And when he left, I thought, oh, well, I'll just, I didn't even think about that. And got one trumpet player, and they were like, man, this book is too hard to do it with one person. At that point, I was like, well, I better go back to 2 trumpets. Because the original band was 2 trumpets, trombone, alto, tenor, and baritone sax, 2 drummers, and tuba. And so we've been doing it with 2 trumpets, and it's been working out much better. And I personally prefer the 2 trumpets just in terms of writing and arranging, because it opens up a lot more possibilities in terms of harmony and having 2, different sections complementing each other
Sure.
in the writing. So it works out much better that way.
Right on.
On many levels.
Well, let me ask you this. How would you define your band? Like, what you guys want to convey musically to an audience and who you guys are as a group? How would you define the band?
It's a New Orleans second-line brass band style band. Okay, and we play everything from traditional jazz to more contemporary things. It's a good time band, but it's also sort of a jam band. And it's great for dancing. People up here, depending on where we're playing, people will dance, and sometimes they just don't know what to do because it's New York and not New Orleans. I have played down in New Orleans, but I've picked up players down there, and it's just been myself, with other players I know from down there that have played with the Dirty Dozen or Rebirth or the Treme Brass Band or the Young Pinstripe Band. I use those players that I know and quite well, and so I've put bands together with that. But up here, it's a different thing, because it's not part of the culture, and people sometimes are familiar with the New Orleans thing, and they'll get up and they'll want to dance. In fact, the last time we played at this restaurant, it's a Cuban restaurant actually, up in Harlem, we had most of the audience, or the people, they were there to eat supper or have drinks, they were all up and dancing, which is really what the band's about,
Absolutely. So why does the New Orleans flavor of jazz, why is it so timeless? Why does it matter these days?
Well, I think it always mattered, for one thing. It's where jazz originated. New Orleans is a unique city in this country. It has its own culture, it has its own cuisine, and it has its own music. Unlike any other city in this country. Many of the musics in this country are based on things that have come out of New Orleans. Rock and roll, rhythm and blues had roots in New Orleans and has influenced, and funk has all their roots in New Orleans. And it's timeless in that way because it continues to grow and evolve but stay true to the roots. Because the guys that are playing in the brass bands, they came up playing traditional, jazz. So they're very in touch with their roots. And I mean, that's very common down there. And some of the players, as they get older, that I know that started, played in high school bands and in marching bands and went away to school or stayed in New Orleans and studied music, got degrees, some of them. And they ended up playing brass band music for a number of years and now have gone on to playing just traditional jazz primarily. They still do brass band things, but not as much. Because the brass band thing is much more demanding, particularly for a trumpet player. than probably any of the other instruments. And also, some of these guys that are playing traditional jazz, they're like in their 70s or older, and some of them are younger. I mean, when I was down there at the end of March this year at Preservation Hall, they had this one young saxophonist who is in his 20s in the band, who has played with the Dirty Dozen and does his own thing. So it's everybody's education and culture is steeped in, the traditional jazz thing in addition to doing everything else. I mean, you can't escape the brass band thing because it's out on the street all the time, whether it's second lines or on Frenchman Street or even in the French Quarter. You'll hear kids that are, like teenagers just getting out there and putting they have a band together and they're playing for tips. And that's their training. A lot of like Rebirth, that's how they started out, playing on the street for tips. And now they're Grammy winners. Same thing with the Hot 8 Brass Band. They started out playing on the street. Grammy nominated. I'm not sure about all the other bands, but those two, because I know these guys, I know that for sure. That's how they started out.
Well, and that's how it begins. And I think about New Orleans in the same fashion that I do Kansas City being one of those initial cradles. But I got to tell you, Rick, thank you. I really appreciate you opening up about the new album. You've given me a wealth of knowledge on not only what you guys are doing as a band, but the new album. I appreciate you taking some time out, and I look forward to profiling you on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New Orleans, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Rick for his class, his music, and his cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.